Hello, my name's Simon Richardson. I'm one of the trustees of New Writing South, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the opening session of the second ever Coast is Queer Literature Festival. Coast is Queer is an incredibly special event that brings together the most interesting and radical voices writing today to celebrate queer lives. We launched the festival in 2019. It was one of the first and remains one of the only queer literature festivals in the UK. It's brought to you by writer development agency New Writing South and leading queer arts producers Marlborough Productions in Brighton. And I like to think our events capture some of the cheeky, permissive spirit of the English seaside in a way only a queer festival can. We had hoped to be back on the beach in Brighton in person in 2020, but the pandemic has made that impossible. So we've moved online. And I want to thank everyone who's put this festival together, working from home in extremely difficult circumstances. We're very excited about the range of writers taking part this year, virtually that is, not least this afternoon's guest, the literary man of the moment, one of the busiest and most sought after writers around. He is Douglas Stuart, winner of the 2020 Booker Prize, joining us live from his home in New York. Welcome, Douglas. I think it's good morning where you are. Thank you for helping us launch the festival. It's very exciting to have you with us.
Oh, good to see you, Simon. I'm so honoured to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's talk about Douglas's winning novel, Shuggie Bain. It's set in a working class part of Glasgow in the 1980s, the tale of a childhood hindered by poverty and a mother's struggle with addiction. But most of all, it's a love story about the bond between Shuggie, a queer little boy, and his mother, Agnes. It's a deeply compelling novel, heartbreaking and uplifting in equal measure. The book's very much inspired by your own childhood, Douglas. Can you start by telling us a little bit about Shuggie? Where does he end and where do you begin?
That's quite a difficult question to answer. Certainly the work is a work of fiction, but I grew up in Glasgow, as you had said, sort of raised on government benefits as the youngest son of a mother who suffered with addiction my entire childhood. As well as the addiction I was facing, or my mother's struggle with that, I also faced bullying and homophobia from the community around me. From probably when I was about 6 or 7 years old, I was told I was no right, or I was very different to everyone around me, and that was drawn from my effeminacy and my precociousness, and so. As we look at Agnes in the book in isolation, I also wanted to really give Shuggie his own problems as well as his mother problems to deal with in that way. And so the book isn't actually a memoir, because if you've read it, Simon, I know you have, it dwarfs all of any experience that just one character could have, because it has quite a span to it. It goes about 40 years and it goes across the city and looks at many characters' different lives. But I did want to draw on the feelings of what it meant to love and lose someone through addiction, but also what it meant to feel incredibly isolated and othered from a very young age.
It's got the visceral qualities that could only come from personal experience, I think. Well, let's have a reading. As I said, there's 2 stars to the novel. Let's meet Agnes. You're going to read for us a section from the beginning of chapter 2, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually where we meet Agnes, who is the mother of the family, and she is in the Sighthill Towers, which are now actually torn down, but at the time they sat almost just in the heart of the city, slightly north of the city centre. And she is frustrated by the smallness of her life. Agnes Bain pushed her toes into the carpet and leaned out as far as she could into the night air. The damp wind kissed her flushed neck and pushed down inside her dress. It felt like a stranger's hand, a sign of living, a reminder of life. With a flick, she watched her cigarette doubt fall, the glowing embers dancing 16 floors down onto the dark forecourt. She wanted to show the city this claret velvet dress. She wanted to feel a little envy from strangers, to dance with men who held her proud and close. Mostly, she wanted to take a good drink, to live a little. With a stretch of her calves, she leaned her hip bone on the window frame and let go of the ballast of her toes. Her body tipped down towards the amber city lights and her cheeks flushed with blood. She reached her arms out to the lights, and for a brief moment she was flying. No one noticed the flying woman. She thought about tilting further then, dared herself to do it. How easy it would be to kid herself that she was flying until it became only falling, and she broke herself on the concrete below. The high-rise flat she still shared with her mother and father pressed in against her. Everything in the room behind her felt so small, so low-ceilinged and stifling. Payday to mass day, a life bought on tick, with nothing that ever felt owned outright. To be 39 and have her husband and her 3 children, 2 of them nearly grown, all crammed together in her mammy's flat, gave her a feeling of failure. Him, her man, who when he shared her bed now seemed to lie on the very edge, made her feel angry with the littered promises of better things. Agnes wanted to put her foot through it all, or to scrape it back like it was spoilt wallpaper, to get her nail under it, and to rip it all away. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you. You can see how spirited Agnes is there, but it's very metaphorical that she's flying and no one can see her, you know. But Shuggie can see her, and it's a very tender relationship they have between parent and child. I'm sure it comes from a mother's love, but also it seems to me that they're both outcasts in a way, aren't they? Agnes is married across the sectarian divide, and Shuggie, well, he's a bit different from the other boys, isn't he?
Yeah, it was definitely a time when I set the novel, it was a time where men had a lot of control. It really was a patriarchy, especially in the working class communities. And so, in a way, when I was crafting the book, it was about how they were both isolated or both affected by men, but in very different ways. I didn't want to write the book where it was just Agnes who was suffering or was having a difficult time reaching her dreams and her potential, because I felt then that we were asking all the other characters to comment on her or to spectate. And throughout the writing of the book, I always wanted myself, first of all, but then the reader to be on Agnes's side, to feel what she went through, not to feel like we were sort of gawping at her. And so Shuggie was important for me because I wanted to show the other side of sort of the patriarchy and the oppression there. And Shuggie's otherness comes from the same sort of things that Agnes suffers with. It's although it's homophobia, it's almost misogyny in a way, because it isn't wrapped. He's too young to have any sexual desire. He's too young to have any sexual notion.
Mm-hmm.
But people reject him because why is he effeminate? Why is he not conforming to the traditional notions of his gender?
I've said that we're trying to channel the spirit of the seaside here. And there's a moment where Agnes and Shuggie's dad go on a memorable trip to Blackpool. You say of her, the wind was whipping off the sea. It had turned the front of her thighs blue with cold, but Agnes couldn't feel it because she was happy. She can find happiness in the most difficult circumstances, can't she? But that trip's also marred with scenes of terrible violence. And the violence haunts the book at times. How much would you say that it defines the lives of these characters?
I wanted to write violence in a way where people had no recourse from it. I think today, and I think for many people, if something violent happens to you, you have an ability to seek retribution or justice, or I hope you do. And growing up in Glasgow at the time, I knew that there was an awful lot of violence behind closed doors, and especially when violence happened in a marriage, there wasn't anywhere to necessarily turn. That was something that people didn't like to look at. It was something that you were meant to keep at home. And as a child that grew up in an environment like that, you were also sort of made to feel in a way that it was your fault, or it was, this was how life was, and there was no other way for life to be, because it was quite pervasive at times. It wasn't necessarily that it was just happening in your house. And so one of the things that I felt was important to capture with the book was the spirit of how when you don't have the comfort of money, then you have to take what comes at you. And the violence that Agnes goes through in that scene actually comes through after one of the happiest moments in the book. She has a really great holiday to Blackpool. She's singing her heart out at the bottom of the stairs, but because her husband can't control her in that moment, because he can't get her to stand up and pick herself up the stairs because she's drunk and conduct herself in a way, she's embarrassing him, conduct herself in a way that he wants her to. He visits awful violence on her as a means to control her. And I'd wanted just to show how these things can live very closely together, Simon, how happiness can come with terror, or tenderness can come with violence, because it can often be that way in life.
Yeah, it's a terrible scene of violence with impunity, because after he basically drags her up the stairs, he says, "I'll take you out dancing in the lights tomorrow," which is it's kind of heartbreaking. Well, we talked about, oh, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say that it's heartbreaking as well, but it's part of the motif of the book about how tomorrow will be a little bit better, but not drastically better, not sort of big literary better, but just a little bit better. If you stop your crying, we'll get up and we'll do it again tomorrow. And life can be like that.
We talked about Shuggie's sexuality marking him out as being different. People notice him He's effeminate at a time when for a young man in that community, that was unacceptable. And there's a really touching scene with his brother Leek, where he's trying to teach him how to appear more straight. Would you read that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Leek is a big supporter of Shuggie in the book. I don't think Leek has the language to be able to sort of, I guess, identify what's going on with his brother and celebrate it in a way, but he is very keen to help his brother fit in so that his brother's life will be easier and he can be less lonely. Shuggie suffers from really severe loneliness in the book. And so this is where we pick up Leek and Shuggie. They've gone scrapping on the closed down pit or the closed down mines. They've gone scrapping for copper. And Shuggie is tagging along with Leek, but he's a bit of a bother. Leek set the boy down. Do you have to be so annoying? Why can't you just be normal for once? The boy turned from his brother. I am normal. Leek thought he could see the pink rise on the back of Shuggie's neck. His shoulders shuddered with the start of tears. Leek spun his brother back around. Don't turn away from me when I'm talking to you. Leek studied his face closely. It hadn't been rising tears. Leek knew the flush of shame and frustration well enough. Are the kids at school still battering you? No. He twisted free from Leek's grip. Sometimes. Don't let it bother you. They see one thing that's a bit more special than them and then they just pile on. Shuggie looked up. I told Father Barry on them. I asked him to make it stop. Shuggie straightened the pleat in his trousers. But he only made me stay behind after the bell. He made me read about the persecuted saints. Leek tried not to smirk. What a useless old bastard. That's just the way of the chapel. Stop complaining, it could be worse. He kicked off his tasseled loafer and, bending over, emptied it of slag dust. You know, when I was at school, they said there was a father that was diddling this one quiet boy. Can you imagine that? He lifted his eyes and met Shuggie's face. Has he ever touched you, Shuggie? Father Barry, that is. A cloud passed over Shuggie's face, dark enough to make Leek stop ridding himself of coal dust. No, he said quietly. Then the words started tumbling out quicker than he could organize them. But they said I did things to him. They said I did dirty things, but I promise. I don't even know what those things are. I believe you, Shuggity. They're just bamming you up. Leek took his brother in his arms, and in a great crushing hug, he mashed the boy's face into his ribs. Anyhows, how old are you now? Shuggie didn't answer right away. He was happy to be suffocated. Then he spoke in a very considered tone, like he was reciting some fact in front of a dusty blackboard. July 16th, 4:20 in the afternoon. You were a difficult birth, Leek, a very difficult birth. Fuck's sake. Shuggie buried his face deeper into Leek's side. I just think we should know things like that about one another. Then he added sullenly, 8. I'm nearly 8.5. 6. Why couldn't you just say that? Anyway, you're big enough. It's time you tried to blend in more. You have to try and be more like those other wee bams. Shuggie turned his head and gasped for air. I am trying, Leek. I try all the time. Those boys let their shirt tails hang out like they have no shame, and all they do is kick that stupid bladder about. I've even seen them put their fingers down the back of their trousers and then smell it. It's so, he searched for the word, common. Leek let him go. If you want to survive, you need to try harder, Shuggie. How? Well, first never say common again. We boys shouldn't talk like old women. Leek hawked a wad of phlegm. And you should try to watch how you walk. Try not to be so swishy. It only puts a target on your back. Leek made a great pantomime of walking like Shuggie. His feet were pointed neatly outwards, his hips dipped and rolled, and his arms swung by his side like there was no solid bone in them. Don't cross your legs when you walk. Try and make room for your cock. Leek grabbed at the bulge in the front of his corduroy, and strode back and forth in a half strut, half lazy amble. Don't bend your knees so much. Take longer, straighter steps. Leek walked around in easy natural circles. Shuggie followed in his wake like a mimic. He was trying his hardest to hold his arms tight. It was hard to make it look normal. They strutted like two cowboys across the flat, upturned earth. On the face of the mine sat the main colliery building, as big as Glasgow Cathedral. The abandoned building sat like a lonely giant on the moon. Large broken windows were set in simple arches, too high for a view, but high enough to catch all the day's light for the cavernous inside. The windows that remained intact were blacked out with coal dust. At the far end of the building, a large smokestack towered into the sky, and on wet days, you could barely see the top for the soaking clouds. Pipes and rods lay scattered on the ground, the hurried tearing of hacksaws visible in the ends, looters taking what they could strip before the mine was officially dismantled for scrap. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, what an amazing reading. What an
I don't
amazing
read that one
section.
so often, so thank
Do
you
you
for
not?
having me. I
Well,
don't.
we're honoured. I mean, it's all there, and it feels like a scene that a lot of people watching will probably recognise from points in their lives. You're not so much exploring a wound there, but the weapon that inflicts it. And the irony of that, of course, is that Leek is trying to protect his little brother. How long did that scene take to write, and how did you feel after you'd written it?
Actually, the funny thing about that scene is it was the very first scene I wrote.
Was it?
It was, yeah. I don't know, it came to me sort of very clearly, and there was something quite cinematic about it when the brothers are walking
Totally.
across this black petrified sea that I wanted to capture and get
Yeah.
on the page. But it's a recurring theme for Shuggie throughout the book. He is trying forever to subvert his true nature and how he actually is. And he does it in the most futile, useless ways in a way, correcting how he talks, correcting how he walks. He even goes through the book and reads, throughout the book, he reads old football scores, historical football scores, which he tries to memorize almost like they're a rosary. And of course, that's a very useless thing to do in a way because it's historical data. He believes if he can do that, that will bring him closer to being like a normal boy. And it's not just his belief in that; it's the people around him think if he can engage himself in that, then he'll get better. And that was what I wanted to show. It's a very ordinary type of situation. It's not unusual. I think so many of us went through that, and Shuggie, I don't think will be unusual in it, but it places such deep roots of self-hate within the boy, and he's forever trying to correct it and trying to be what the world expects of him.
I'm fascinated that you I've just written down setting. This amazing emblematic setting. It seems so dramatic. Do all your kind of works start with a scene like that? Is there a moment that you think I'm gonna capture that and something else is gonna grow from it?
They often start. I actually come from a visual arts background instead of a creative writing background. And so I often start with images in my mind, or images actually on paper. I look at a lot of old photographs, a lot of old movies. I'm inspired a lot by cinema. And so when I can really imagine, and I, as the writer, can step over the threshold of the scene, and suddenly it fills in around me, almost a bit like the Matrix, then I know that I'm starting to feel the energy of it. And so I try to envision everything first visually, and then work from there, because one of the things I wanted to do with the book is when anyone read it, I wanted them to be as immersed in the world as possible, because there was a way to present these characters where you could almost gawp at them and then leave. And I didn't want that because I felt their lives were more important and more urgent and they had more to say. And so I wanted the reader to be able to open the door and really sit in the room with Shuggie or ride on the bus with him or whatever it was. And so I use visual clues to do that.
And it adds weight to what is an incredibly kind of almost primal scene in Shuggie's kind of, I imagine in his sexual identity, in a sense, he could look back on this moment. I think lots of people, I talked about that idea of a wound a minute ago. I think lots of people have the scars of knowing from childhood that we were somehow unacceptable. That's a kind of central part of our identity a lot of the time, sadly. But I wondered how important that is to you as in your vocation as a writer.
Yeah, I think I'm always writing about loneliness. The more I write and the more I sort of look at my work on the page, it's always about a sense of belonging. And for someone trying to fit in the world they find themselves in, that was certainly how I grew up as a young gay man, and even as a young gay adult, was trying to find myself and come to terms with loving myself and being all right where I was and where I stood. And that's had such a powerful inspiration on me. And so it shows up in the work I've done for the New Yorker, my next novel I'm working on. It runs all the way through Shuggie. And so when I think about queerness, I think about loneliness a lot of the time. And that's not everybody's experience with growing up. It's certainly not the experience of a lot of young queer people today, but it was mine. And so that's what I'm mining.
Yeah, you said in the interview in the New Yorker, you said, I've read so many liberal, enlightened, supportive, reciprocal queer love stories in recent years, and I think that's a really positive reflection on our times now, but that doesn't capture the truth of how it goes for many of us. So what do you think the kind of role of queer fiction should be in 2021? What in a queer kind of I don't want to say discourse, that's too academic, but what's the role, do you think, of queer books now, as opposed to, say, queer books that Shuggie might have discovered when he was little?
I think it only has one role, and that's to be as prismatic as possible. I think we are living in a really wonderful time where queer people are not perhaps all living through the same lived experience or the same upbringing or the same coming of age tales.
What do you mean by, forgive me, what do you mean by prismatic?
I mean, we should show all types of stories.
Okay.
We should celebrate all of them.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, it was queer fiction could often be a sort of a sad story or something people were hard done to or they were ostracized.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's how queer history was for most of it. It was, there was never always a happy ending, or there was rarely a happy ending. And I think now we have this very sort of varied experience, and so we should celebrate all of that. But what I sometimes feel is, in our rush to celebrate, we overlook people who might feel left behind by progress in the, and some of that can be because of the time or the era the book is set in, but also I do believe people are still feeling a bit left behind today, or can't find themselves in it. And so we just have to express it, or queerness at its broadest lens.
Yeah, it's great that we're in a time when you can have a big prism like that, books that remember, books that warn, books that celebrate, and books that explain, I
mean, even if we think about the past year, we have a book like Shuggie that talks about a hard northern childhood, and then we have Memorial by Brian Washington, which is in a lot of ways a very ordinary look at a very ordinary relationship. And then we have The Prophets by Robert Jones, which looks at love in the time of slavery. And so that's really fascinating. And then we have Detransition Baby. We have all of these amazing queer experiences, and just more of it, I think, is all we have to do, and keep showing it at its fullest.
That book, The Prophets, absolutely fascinating. And the thing that was so fun is it's about two slaves on a plantation in the 19th century, I think, in America. They're in a gay relationship. And the thing that was so fascinating about it was the fact that the community around them knew about it and sort of accepted it. Is that right?
I actually have only got past the first chapter. It's right over.
Me too.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Talk about it like we know what we're talking about. Yeah. I'm excited to read it.
I thought the idea of a community accepting a relationship like that at that time was pretty radical. Mm-hmm. But of course, go back 1,000 years, and that was kind of normal. Mm-hmm. Anyway, let's move on. That New Yorker interview was about the short story you published called Found Wanting, which is really moving. It's about a young man living alone, like you did in Glasgow, trying to make ends meet, and it describes life for young queer people before the internet and the lengths you needed to go to meet people like yourself. And I think you've got a reading from that story.
I do, yeah. Thank you. This is actually something I've not read other than for the New Yorker, but
thank you.
So the boy is actually living in a bedsit in Glasgow, and even though he's in the center of the city, he cannot find his tribe. And so he sets about replying and placing an ad in the back of a teen magazine. There were personal ads on the back pages of a youth magazine, a glossy that I devoured because the nights were too quiet and I could not afford the company of a television. Underneath the heterosexuals were the tentative notices for young gay men and women. There was nothing seedy about these lonely hearts. These were not the explicit offers I would trawl later in the free gay papers. This was in the early 90s, long before the internet with its miles and miles of headless torsos, all hairless and strangely similar. There was nothing sexual here. It was a beacon for invisible youth. I was lonely. I had been lonely for a long time. These boys were lonely too. This was why we were gathering here, beneath the straight people. Glasgow lad, M, 17, discreet, not out. Black hair, green eyes, slim body. Likes the Smiths, Michelle Pfeiffer, Thomas Hardy, Ab Fab. Shy, looking for same. P.O. Box 33541. I sat cross-legged on the end of my single bed and summarised my pale, dull self in 30 words or less. The postal order would mean I had no bus fare, that I would have to walk to and from school for a week, but I didn't care. I wrote the advert and lay back, feeling, for the first time in a long while, giddy with hope. The young men who replied to me came from all over the country. Some of their letters tried too hard to be funny and were caustic sounding, masking awful hurt. Some presented a thin veneer of cockiness, as though there was just a laugh to them, yet here they were, sitting cross-legged in bedrooms, reaching out to strangers, same as me. Other letters were vulnerable, heartbreakingly tender. There was a boy who was younger than I was, a crofter's son, who lived in the remotest corner of the Scottish Highlands, not another soul for years and miles. He wrote as though he assumed he was not going to receive a reply. He asked me no questions. He didn't hurry me to respond like all the others did. It read like a message in a bottle. I could picture him climbing the side of a Munro, the type of majestic mountain they painted on tins of tourist shortbread, and calling out across the empty glen, yet to hear the echo. All the letters were handwritten, torn from notebooks, charming in their regional slang. Their scrawl rushed across the page as if the words were burning out of them. Some letters were 10, 12, 20 pages long, ink changing colour as pens bled to excited deaths. The boys sent photographs of themselves, innocent time stamped super snaps. Holiday pictures with grandparents folded to the back were photographs of them grinning in bedrooms whose walls were plastered with posters of Kylie Minogue, Madonna, Cats the musical. I laid all the letters out before me. It was hard to see the night sky from the middle of the leaden, sullen city. My mother had taken me to Saltcoats once, to the shingled coast. A man who was using her had rented a dented caravan so they could be farther from his wife. He would come on the weekend, but we would have the week to ourselves. On our first night alone, we sat outside the caravan as she smoked and watched the stars peek through the heavy clouds. The letters felt like this to me. I would never reach these boys, never touch them, but they shone bright in the northern sky. It was enough to know that they were there. Thank you.
Ah, that's beautiful. Thank you. I love the idea of the sexual undertone of the pens bleeding to excited deaths and the echo that's not returned. That's so sad. But I'm thinking about these letters, and I think about how a courtship might play out on Grindr now in a matter of minutes, and it doesn't really bear comparison, does it?
It doesn't. And, you know, I wanted to, it was funny because I have a lot of young gay friends and they couldn't believe, because they'd come of age of the internet, they couldn't believe it was so difficult to just identify with other people, because you can see it on Instagram even. You don't have to, it doesn't have to be dating websites. And so I wanted to really write this story just to add another voice to queer history, to say, actually, there was a time when we had to write letters, and the letters were overwhelmingly innocent. They were like pen pals and long form correspondence. And some of the biggest thing they achieved was just to make you feel less alone. And that was an incredibly powerful and wonderful thing. It wasn't always about sexual bartering or trying to find a romantic love or a hookup. And it was just about not feeling like you were the only person, because you'd been told for the last 17 years you were the only person. And so I wanted to write about that.
So I'm seeing here a kind of apprenticeship as a writer in writing these the letters, and you benefited from another kind of quite unexpected training ground, didn't you? When you were ghostwriting your mother's memoir. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think to call it a memoir is a little bit too grand because we didn't get very far. But you know, when you're, my mother died when I was 16 from her addiction. And when you're the child of a parent who is suffering with addiction, you learn all kinds of tricks and strategies to try and make them feel better, to try and keep them sober, to try and keep them at home, whatever it is. And one of the things I learned when I was about 8 years old is I could really focus my mother's attention on me if I sat down and listened to her stories. And that blossomed into writing her memoir. So I would get a school book and I'd get a pen, and she would sit and almost notate to me what her, sort of all the heartbreak and all the things that she felt had failed in her younger life that she had no one else to tell or no one else to listen to. And we never got very far because obviously there was alcohol involved, but she always began with a dedication to Elizabeth Taylor. And it always ran, you know, for Elizabeth Taylor, who knows nothing about love. And even it was years and years later, I was sitting writing Shuggie and thinking about this dedication. I was thinking, that is so bold for this woman in Glasgow to think, first of all, she's writing a memoir, and then to tell Elizabeth Taylor, first of all. But at the time, I was trying to put myself in my mother's shoes and think about Elizabeth Taylor as being this very defiant, bold woman who really celebrated, you know, success and failure in her love life, who drank, who in every movie she was in was always difficult and demanding, and you know, sometimes she could be she was never meek, you know, she was never cowed, and she was this really glorious figure. And then here was my mother, and women like my mother, who were being the same sort of thing, but were being isolated and persecuted for it.
If people like that didn't exist, we'd have to make them up, wouldn't we? You know. So we talked a bit about your steps to becoming a writer, but that doesn't happen in a vacuum. I'd like to ask about your own literary inspirations now. When you were becoming a writer, who were the voices that really talked to you?
Oh, so many. I mean, first of all, you know, I owe a huge debt to Scottish literature and to working class fiction as well, even from the north of England. One of my favourite books ever is actually A Kestrel for a Knave by Barry Hines, which became the Ken Loach film Kess. But it's a very quiet book about domesticity and about real lives, and it's a beautiful book, and the dialect in it is stunning. And then
he's a fan of yours, I think, Ken Loach.
Oh, well, I don't know about that. He sent some supportive notes, but I think to claim him as a fan is a bit, I wouldn't be so presumptive. But,
Oh, go on.
But, you know, queer fiction as well, when I discovered it, I didn't really get to read queer fiction until I was in my 20s, until I could create a safe space for myself and then, you know, really read those books. And so Alan Hollinghurst is a huge inspiration on me. James Baldwin. I love Alexander Chee. I'm rereading right now The Naked Civil Servant by Quentin Crisp, just as a part of sort of gender history is fascinating as a first person account. But there's so many. I mean, Jeanette Winterston as well. I love Jeanette Winterston because she intersects with working class lives and also queerness. And there's too many to mention.
I asked Alan Hollinghurst in the session that we've recorded for Coast is Queer if he had any advice for you, because he won the Booker, and obviously winning the Booker changes your life. And he told me to tell you that you don't need any advice. He's just sad that this whole jamboree is happening from your front room. You know.
You've just blown my mind. Alan Hollinghurst was one of my heroes. Just to even think that he knows who I am is huge. It's enormous, but it's been a weird year. I mean, it's been such a phenomenal year for me in my writing career. But it's true, I've never left home. You know, I go to the shop, and then I come home. But Shuggie's been having such a wonderful life, especially in the United Kingdom, and I haven't seen my family since last March, as many of us haven't, and so it's been strange.
Is it good for your writing, for your creative imagination? I sense you have a lot of deadlines now, but if you didn't, are you a writer who would benefit from a lockdown, or are you one of those people who needs the kind of caprices of modern day life?
No, I need my mind to be quiet, and I've found my mind has not been able to be quiet during lockdown because I've been so worried about other people, about all the sort of tensions around race that have been happening in the States. The president that we just got rid of, all of these things. It's really hard to just, you know, to not feel anxious. I'm a very anxious person. And so I don't mind if the world is busy or not. I just need to not feel besieged by all these things all the time, you know?
You talked earlier about how your visual sense has been an important part of writing the book. Can you tell me, I'd like to come to that in a minute actually, but you were a designer in New York working for the likes of Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren. Could you tell me just a bit about how you wrote that book while you had also a very demanding job, I gather?
Yeah, I mean, I always wanted to be a writer as a kid, but I didn't. My academic skills were really poor because of bullying, because of my mother's addiction, because of where I grew up and the things that were happening in the neighborhood around me. And so just English was not seen as something that a boy like me could do. And that was seen actually as a very encouraging thing. They were trying to funnel me into something that I'd be successful at. And so I was steered into textiles. And so I actually have a very honest Scottish trade background. You know, I can knit, I can weave, I can make any kind of cloth you can imagine. And it was that blossomed into fashion for me. No one really even saw that coming. But that sort of opened up, and I went to the Royal College of Art and I got my master's, and that's what brought me to New York. But I was at the height of my fashion career working for some big brands here in New York when I just couldn't. I'd been writing for many years and writing scraps and pieces and scenes. And I thought, I've got to sit down and I've got to do this because I needed to. It was as much, it wasn't really necessarily a conscious thought as much as it was a need. It was a very visceral need for me. And so I sat down and I wrote Shuggie, and I would write sometimes in the morning before I went to work. New York's an incredibly demanding city. I would start at 8 o'clock in the morning. I wouldn't finish till 10 o'clock at night with my job. I would work weekends. I was on a plane 14 times a year. So I was gone a lot. And so I had to, for the most part, make writing work around my life. And then when I finished the first draft of the book, it took me maybe a year and a half. I just loved working on it further, learning, honing my craft, but also spending time with the characters. And it took about 10 years all in. And part of that was because I didn't want to say goodbye.
Oh, that's fascinating, because it must be, as well as uplifting, it must have been an emotional wrench. I mean, the cliche would be to ask you if it was cathartic. How did you feel the minute you kind of finally finished it, when you closed that book?
It's almost before I finish it, it started to feel like a thing I had to give away. And that's why I pursued getting it published, because 10 years of my life with this book was almost too much. Like, I had to sort of close the chapter on myself and move forward with my next project, my next book, my next short story. And so I felt the book brought a lot of wonderful things into my life. It brought a lot of joy, which people are sometimes surprised to hear, because the book has a lot of very sad things in it, but it brought a lot of joy. It was a wonderful way for me as a Scottish migrant to reconnect with Glasgow all the time. I'm home in Glasgow 2-3 times a year, but writing the book was a way for me every single day to feel at home with my family and the people I love and all of that. And so when I finished the book, I felt this sort of peace with it. And then I discovered the trauma of publishing, when you share your most intimate things with the world. So writing it was easy, but it was the sharing it that proved tough.
I'm not going to go into the number of times it was rejected. I feel like you've been subjected to that.
You can.
Well, I'll just say to everyone watching, it was rejected 32 times, and Douglas is an example of why you must keep trying.
Actually, I'll give you the real news. It was rejected 44 times on both
What?
sides. On both sides.
Just 32 in the States. Oh my God.
Yeah. But rejection is a part of a writer's life. And we have to come to terms with it. Shuggie is actually, after winning the Booker, is still being rejected. And that's just how it is. People might not want to engage with it. But you have to go through those. You have to learn faith in your own work. You have to have tenacity. You have to have resilience. And it's such a subjective field that you have to really believe in what you're doing, because it will get rejected.
What do you mean he's still being rejected?
Well, there's international publishers who still are saying this is not a book for us. And so even with something like the Booker, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to come to the book.
Yeah. Oh, that's really, really interesting. Let's talk about the night everything changed. So Shuggie Bain was already a successful book. It had been shortlisted for some big awards, but then came the 19th of November, a particularly unusual Booker Prize ceremony. Tell me a bit about the evening.
Oh yeah, actually, I have to go back a bit before it. Shuggie had been nominated for some big awards, the National Book Award and some others here in America, which I was really pleased with on behalf of Scottish fiction. I thought that was amazing. And also for immigrant voices here in the States, I thought it was really powerful. But I lost. I didn't win them. And these happened like 2 or 3 days before the Booker. And so I think I'd lost 3 times in the lead up to the Booker. And so I came to it with no expectations. And it was the biggest moment of my writing career, just to be on that list with those other writers. So I spent the months beforehand reading all the shortlist of the work, because I wanted to be as present. I knew I wouldn't be in a room with them. I knew I wouldn't have any of the usual feelings or experiences. And so I wanted just to immerse myself in it. And so I read all of their work, and I'd come into it already feeling like sort of being on a roll of losing. And then they announced it, and I was just blown away. I mean, I was genuinely stunned. And that, I had an out-of-body experience. Everyone says to me, you pulled yourself together and you said very lucid things. And I don't know where my mind went, because it was only my body here. And so I did it. But it was brilliant. I'm just looking forward to celebrating with my family, I think.
Yeah, God, the hug, the simple hug, isn't it? I remember talking to you the next morning for the radio program that I work on. I did think you sounded incredibly assured. You kind of look like you've been doing this all your life, Douglas. What's the secret?
Oh, I don't know, but thanks for saying that. I have no idea what the secret is.
I think it'll be lovely for you to get in a room with some readers again, won't it?
Yeah, it will. That's one of actually, that might be a thing that some of the people listening would be interested to hear, because I'm a debut novelist, and I published about a week before the pandemic hit, and everything in the universe was swallowed, maybe 2 weeks. I only actually ever been in a room with readers once, and those readers were mostly my family and my friends.
Wow.
And so I've never had a physical interaction with people who have read the book and then been in a room with me, and that's a very strange way, but that's the world for me.
That is really, that's unique.
Unusual. It's yeah.
Yeah,
It's unusual. I have some friends who are also in the same boat who are debut novelists, but
I know it's been such a difficult time for debut novelists because the bandwidth is so narrow.
hmm.
I mean, you're expected to go around the world hawking your wares, aren't you? And that can be quite onerous, I believe, but also I imagine incredibly rewarding. So God, yeah, I can't wait for you to be able to do that. One of the things that's happened since you won is that Hollywood has come knocking on the door. Can you tell me a little bit about the adaptation of Shuggie Bain that is now in the works?
Yeah, well, I can tell you first of all, I'm breaking it because I signed up to write the script myself, and so I'm working through that just now. But I'm really excited. Before Shuggie won the Booker, A24 Pictures and Scott Rudin came forward and said they would love to see this on the screen. They thought it. They thought
So before.
Yeah, it was before. Yeah,
Oh, great.
it was announced afterwards, but the conversations were before.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it just takes a long time to agree to things, but no, it was several weeks before. And I just thought A24 are so phenomenal with what they do that they would do it. And when I asked, they thought it was a film, and I said, actually, I don't think it is a film. I wanted to give the characters space to evolve and to show, especially Agnes's journey. And they were like, great, then it can be a series. And so we're currently working through it just now, but it's just at the beginning of the journey.
Yeah, I think we're living in a time of long form storytelling, aren't we? And it feels like a book to me where to get it over with in 90 minutes, it's just not necessary now. The world is ready for long form storytelling. So, yeah.
I also think Agnes is a voice we don't hear from very often in Shuggie, and it's not that we don't hear from mothers or for sons, but Thatcher's Britain in the 80s, and women had very powerful, louding voices, but society didn't necessarily always listen to the working class mother. And so I wanted to give Agnes a chance, the character of Agnes, to say everything she had to say, and the series felt like the right place to do that.
I wonder if you've been watching the other big gay drama set in the 1980s. It's a Sin. I'm asking everybody this. I'm sure I imagine you have. Have you?
I'm going to disappoint you because it's not here in New York.
Oh,
It's another 2 weeks away. So I've heard brilliant things about it, but I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, it's amazing. So you're writing the screenplay for Shuggie yourself, I believe, which is very exciting and not something they always trust the author to do. How's it going?
I can't jinx that by answering that, but it's interesting. It's very different from writing a novel. As a novelist, I love prose, I love language, and screenplays are about action and about the urgency of a character and what they show through dialogue and their actions. And so it's a very different thing, but I'm excited, and I think it was such an intimate story for me as well, Simon. These characters really come from deep inside me that I felt very protective of them, and I didn't want to hand it over to someone else. And I also wanted to round out and show more dimension to a lot of the characters. Leek, I think, will be a much bigger deal in the series, and Agnes has a lot more to say, and so I wanted to also do that.
Well, we're kind of nearly out of time, but I want to ask you before we go about the other things that you're writing, because I don't think you've just got one new book on the go. I think you've got two. Is that right? What are you willing to say?
What am I willing to say? I'm really excited about my next novel, which I'm working on edits for at the moment. Hopefully it will be with you in spring of 2022, so this time next year. But it is a love story. We leave Shuggie at the end of Shuggie Bain, when he's just coming into himself and his manhood, and that was the right place to leave him because it is the end of Agnes and the start of Shuggie. But it left me with a desire, almost like my New Yorker stories, to go back and look at what's it like for a 15-year-old boy in Glasgow in the 90s, growing up with an overbearing brother and an overbearing sister as well. And so this new novel focuses on an entirely different cast of characters, but it looks at two boys who fall in love but are kept apart by sectarian divides. And so there's a territorial sort of lines thing that turns them into almost a Romeo and Juliet. But one of the boys is sent into the north of Scotland in order to make a man out of him, and it has disastrous consequences.
That's very exciting. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think you winning the Booker shows just how we're living through an amazing period of queer literature. I'm being sent a lot of queer books in my day job. It's really exciting. There's been a step change even since we put the festival on first time in 2020. I know you're in the middle of writing a lot. Do you have much time to read? And what are you enjoying at the moment, apart from The Naked Civil Servant?
Yeah, I'm finding I don't have a huge amount of time to read at the moment, but I'm trying to read as much as I can. I do find a sneaky way around that is to listen to an awful lot of audiobooks. Then they can keep you company when you have to do something else. And for me, audiobooks that I love is I love Kevin Barry, because it's great to especially hear it when it's narrated in the author's voice, and the evocativeness of his work is just outstanding.
Oh, yeah.
And then Deshaun Charles Winslow's book In West Mills was beautiful. I don't know if you've read that yet. And actually, I'm listening to Pachinko just now. I didn't read Pachinko when it came out. And Minjin and I are doing an event in a couple of weeks for the Penn Faulkner Awards. And I wanted to make sure I'd absorb that, because it's an amazing book. I'm about halfway through and it's such an epic.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Well, my last question is, one of the organizers of this festival, New Writing South, we're here to inspire and support emerging writers, especially people who think becoming an author is not for the likes of them. And some people felt becoming an author wasn't for the likes of you at one point. Do you have any words of inspiration for those people?
I always find this question difficult because it's not like I have a huge amount of experience, and all the experience I have has been sort of directed on self or focused only on myself. But I will say is sometimes society gives us cues or clues that make us feel like our own existence isn't worth very much or worth sharing, or that there's no value in it, and there is. And so wherever you are, the streets that you walk on, the people you love, the conflicts you have can be enough, and are enough, and people want you to share them. I would say trust in the things you don't know. And what I mean by that is read everything that you can get your hands on, but also write. The thing about being a writer is you have to write. And sometimes you don't know perhaps where it's going or what it's going to be, but you do have to commit to coming to the page, and it takes a lot to get there. But do that and commit to that.
Brilliant advice. Thank you. Thank you very much for a lovely interview. You're always so generous and wise. Now, we have some lovely questions here in this chat box that I've never opened before, but look, here they are. Excellent. Let's start with a question from anonymous 10D. I might know the answer to this one already. Could you tell us more about Loch Awe? Did you rewrite it as much as Shuggie Bain?
That's a great question. Hello, anonymous attendee. Nice to meet you. But actually, thank you for everyone for coming today. I know it's a bit of an odd time as well, so I really appreciate that. Loch Awe, or book number 2, because it might get a title change. I'm still working through that at the moment. But book number 2 came out in a much more propulsive way. And I think hopefully if you read it, when you read it, you'll see that it has a little bit more of a forward thrust to it. But I understood that I wanted to really look at a much shorter period of time. And there's a compression and an oppression that the characters go through in the book that's also served by the format of the book. And so it really looks at what's happening in a January to this one boy, the month of January, and then also in the month of July. And these two events that happen in his life that make him the man that he is. And so in a way I think I wrote maybe about 7 drafts of it. Shuggie, I think, was up at 14 drafts. But I began it in 2016 and finished it at the end of last year.
So by that logic, 3.5 drafts for the next book. Okay, Beck Pearson says, I'd love to know whether you plotted the book in advance or were led by the character and wrote the scenes as Shuggie dictated to you.
That's a brilliant question. Thank you. I plotted the scenes, the vignettes, in advance. So I wouldn't go into a vignette without knowing what happened at the beginning of the chapter and the end of it. And then very loosely, I plotted the overarching things that happened to the 2 main characters, what they wanted, what they weren't going to get, how that was going to be. I had a very clear idea when I was writing Shuggie about where we opened and where we ended. How Shuggie came into the story and how he left it. And so those things were in place. But what I didn't necessarily always know, because I wrote a lot of the chapters out of chronological order, was perhaps I didn't know how we got from chapter 7 to chapter 10. those things in between it. And actually, there was occasionally in the book, there would be a chapter 12.5 and a chapter, 12.75. There were chapters that I then took out or I edited. And so I didn't necessarily know every single step, but I knew the overarching thing, and I wouldn't sit down and write a chapter without knowing what happened in it or having a vague idea.
That's great, thank you. Maria and Deb say, your writing is set in your Scottish background. Could you ever see yourself writing a book with a fashion background as a setting?
I would love to. I think I feel like I'm working through some things chronologically, even though I don't write chronologically when I write the book. I'm working through my own sort of inspiration index in a chronological way. And so I'm waiting for the New York fashion book to tell me the time is right. It's there, but I'm waiting for it to put its hand on my shoulder and say, now you've got to do it. But I think definitely.
That's very exciting. Dave Wheatley says, it'd be interesting to know how conscious Douglas is about writing stories about or from one gay generation for one that has grown up in and experienced a very different social context.
Yeah, I think about that all the time. I think about it also in terms of sort of Vogue and fashion and how much people wanted to listen and hear Shuggie. When I was writing Shuggie and it was when it was being published, I was very aware that we were celebrating gay life and inclusivity. And here I'd written a book about disorientation and about being excluded from things. And so I thought about that an awful lot, but it made me feel like it was more important to keep going with it because things had shifted so much and so quickly that I felt that people that maybe had grown up in that way, where they felt, even in the middle of a city, felt isolated because of being queer, we weren't listening to those voices. I also felt an awful lot that, I don't know how to say this eloquently, but that my own experience as a gay man was, and in literature, was caught between the celebration and the more sort of prismatic way we look at literature today, but then also by the AIDS epidemic on the back half. And I felt like I came up, I was 15 probably, or I came into my coming of age when AIDS was at its peak, or sort of in the early 90s. And so I felt like there was a quiet moment there that is in the shadow of fear, that is before interconnectivity, before all this hope and global acceptance or the movement towards it, that I just wanted to focus on. And actually, I think that's why I come back with it and look at it in book number 2 too, because I felt like it's such an interesting time to me personally.
So that moment after the AIDS crisis has kind of exploded and all of it felt, I imagine, like so much of the progress that happened before was sort of gone and things were starting again.
Yeah. And, it was just, it feels like there's these two landmark moments in gay literature. And, the AIDS crisis still goes on, but when it was really at its peak and the 80s and the 90s, it felt like that moment in between it sort of got swallowed by it, that mid-90s gay experience. And I wanted to, especially a coming of age in it. And so that's just where I'm focused.
Yeah, it's so interesting how queer history, queer literature, it's all incredibly cyclical, isn't it? Things go forward, but they also do go backwards. Jane Marin says, huge congratulations as a would-be novelist who can find anything, sorry, I'll read that again. As a would-be novelist who can find anything to do but write, how did you set your time aside to write? And how did work not get in the way?
I had to be really hard on myself. For me, I had a desire to write, and what I mean by that is, even when I was working in a very creative field, all I wanted to do was be done with that and then get back to the page. I really just wanted to do it. So I thought of a lot of my time as just get through this so that I can get back to the desk. But I learned a lot of little sort of tips and hacks, I guess. I would write on the subway. I would write on my phone. I would run dialogue back and forth in my mind all day, even when I was at work. I used to love getting on a plane when nobody could reach me or want anything because I had a team to manage at my job. And so that would give me, sometimes when I would fly to Hong Kong, it would give me 16 hours just by myself, and I would use it to write. First of all, I would watch some terrible movies and then I would write. But I think it's just, you have to, I guess it's discipline. It's different for all of us, but I just tried to get it where I could find it.
Staying with the idea of the fashion business, Julie A says, are you now working as a full-time writer then, and have you given it up?
I am. It's a more complicated question than that. I have given up running fashion brands, meaning working in corporate fashion and sort of helping them reach their business goals and their seasonal collections. That's not for me. I am a full-time writer, meaning I'm dedicating all my time to writing. But you know, fashion and visual arts are a big part of my life. So I always like to be creative. I knit in my spare time. I draw when I have time, and so that's always important. But I don't think you'll see me behind the desk of a big fashion company again.
What do you think of the skill? Is the skill set shared between being a visual designer and being a writer?
I mean, that's almost, it's a big question. I think, first of all, to say they're incredibly different. You know, fashion or a visual designer is all about instinct and expression and speed and collaboration, and writing is about reflection and take as much time as you need and really sort of isolation. And so they're very different in that way. For me, what I tried to pull across from it was an attention for detail, a respect for craft on both the micro level. As a textile designer, you know, I'm always thinking about a tiny stitch or a word, and then how it ladders up to something much bigger than itself. And so I was very used to the discipline of repetition and accumulation, about doing something over and over and over again and knowing that it would grow to something bigger. And so for me, that was a good, just sort of muscle memory almost to have when I came to writing. But they both should be involved in storytelling, and they both should be, obviously writing is, but fashion also should be. And it should be about evoking a feeling in someone. Usually that's joy or whatever you want to feel. But when you design something in clothing, it should make people feel something. And so you try to use that power of emotion in my writing also.
I imagine you being like Alistair Gray, a kind of artisan novelist. I think that would
Yeah.
be
I've actually
exciting.
I've started to have a circle of friends that are all do something visual. You know, I think about Elizabeth McNeil, who's an amazing ceramicist, and you know, I know Raven Lilani, who wrote Luster, is a painter as well. She paints these incredible portraits, and sometimes it's good to be involved. If you get stuck with your writing, two things work for me. Is I like to then go look at visual things because it inspires me. I look at old photographs, I look at, you know, movies or whatever it is, and it fills me with a lot of inspiration. I think about light, I think about how people enter a room, how they carry themselves. But also sometimes I find if I engage my mind on something visual, drawing or knitting or weaving or whatever it is, then ideas for the book come to me when you almost sort of trick your mind into thinking about something else. So I would say for most writers, get yourself something to do with your hands and keep your hands busy when you're not feeling so, you know, inspired to go to the desk.
That's great. A couple of questions about the short stories. The first one I can answer is, can they be accessed online? And yes, they're both free on the New Yorker website, as far as I'm aware. WPS says, could you share the difference between the writing experience of the short stories compared to the novel?
Yeah, I don't know if I can be so eloquent, but I find there's an enormous amount of power in a short story. It has to be so contained and really pull someone through very quickly. And actually, after writing Shuggie and writing something that was so expansive and looked at all these times and these characters, and it has a huge chorus of characters. I found a huge thirst for writing some short stories because I wanted to get my arms around something manageable. But in terms of what makes a good short story, I think you're still trying to really move somebody in the same way. It's just about the sort of the space you have to do that. You're still trying to bring someone in at the beginning of the story and then rearrange them before you let them leave at the end. And so I don't know if that's very good advice, but I never think of a short story as just one scene in someone's life. I always think of it as they come in with things that they want and they want to achieve, and then they leave having achieved that or not.
Robert Hamburger says, how long did Shuggie take you to write, and how did you manage those self-doubts or self-sabotaging traits that seem built into working class writers as they draft?
Shuggie took me about 10 years to write. It took me probably, I mean, it depends on where you want to mark. It took about 2 years for the first draft, took about 10 years to finally prize it out of my hands. And a lot of that was because I am a writer who can work on a draft quite quickly, but then I will go back and revise and think about it and change and edit a lot. That seems to be my process. The self-doubts are hard, man. I don't know what to tell you. They're still with me today. I think they're coded into us by the society we grow up in. And I kept coming back to the point of thinking, just on behalf of the characters almost in a way, and I guess supposing like I just wanted to show their story, and I had a belief in them, and I had a belief in the book that eclipsed my feelings as who I was as a writer, or should I be doing this, or was this a worthy thing to do. The other thing that actually design taught me quite quickly that helped me a lot was you'll never be the greatest at everything. You'll never be the greatest, you know, writer, or be able to be Toni Morrison or Cormac McCarthy, but you will have a thing within you that is something that you do better than everybody else. And so what you have to do is almost lean into that muscle. You have to shore up the places where you're weak. But as a writer, you just lean into the thing that you do better than everybody else, and then push that as hard as you can. And that becomes a unique point of view after a while. And that helped me get over my doubts. Because when I started writing Shuggie, you know, I was looking at all of my idols and all the people I admired and thinking, God, you're crap compared to them. And it was only when I actually leaned into my visual culture that I just took the book on its own terms.
That's great. Rodolfo Publico says, they say one of the secrets of good writing is rewriting. Oh, questions are coming in, so the questions are disappearing up the screen. When you write, at what point do you know that your story is finally complete and that no amount of rewriting will make a difference any longer, that it's finally time to put the pen down?
Oh, brilliant question, Rodolfo. Nice to hear from you. And thank you for coming. I know Rodolfo, so that's awesome.
Ah, great.
To be honest, I'm not someone who puts a pen down willingly, and my editor would probably answer that question. I mean, even when we went through the edits with my editor, he was like, "You're done. Like, you have to be done," because I enjoy touching and rewriting and doing all of that. But I think you know when you are fiddling. There comes a point when really all you're doing is sort of fiddling with sentence structure, and you've reached the end of what these characters can tell you and what they can say. And often it appears in repetition for me. So the character keeps doing the same thing, or picking their nail in the same way, or saying the same thing. And then I think to myself, well, they've told me everything they have to say.
That's great. That should have been our last question, really, but there's a couple more. Natalia V says, as you're writing from the viewpoint of a child in the book, how did you get into that mindset? Was it just from memory?
It was really helpful for me to construct Shuggie as a character, because Shuggie as a character is really precocious. And because his entire universe is adults, and specifically his mother, it was easy for me to turn him almost into slightly wiser than his years, or slightly more observant. And in truth, that's what kids are like when they have addicted parents, because they're forever confronted with things. They're seeing things they shouldn't see, that kids just shouldn't see. And so in a way, I actually didn't want to write a kid, because I don't love writing from young children's point of view, or their view of the world. As a writer, that's not what I liked. And I wanted very quickly to make Shuggie be almost this quite wise young man, or certainly more emotionally connected than I ever was as a kid, because I was just sort of washed about on the high seas, I think. But Shuggie is slightly more in control and slightly more aware. And so that was a trick I used. But I also didn't want the book to be told, even though it's called Shuggie Bain, I didn't want it to be told from his point of view, because I realized that kids don't understand everything about the world, nor can they say complex things about misogyny or unemployment or addiction, or what a woman might be looking for when her husband leaves her and how she feels. And so I didn't want to anchor everything on Shuggie's shoulders.
Thank you. Antonia Canning says, you come across as very educated. How did you close that gap when your earlier schooling was interrupted?
Thank you. That's a lovely thing to say. I don't feel very educated. I mean, I still feel very lacking in things that I don't know. And like I said earlier, I try to move to the things that I feel like I have a command of, and show up where I can, but I don't let it bog me down. I think we're all individual people and we have that. But, you know, I'm very fortunate to be Scottish. I think if I'd have grown up so poor in another country, I might not have had access to education in the way the Scottish government allowed me to have. And so my education, after my mum died, I was alone in the world, and nobody in my family had finished high school, and I'd seen the mass unemployment across Glasgow, and I knew I couldn't go into the trades like my brother had or my uncles had, because they were knocking their pan in and they were still running out of money at the end of the week, or they couldn't find work. And so education was quite a new notion for the working class in the early 90s. And I was grateful that I had a government that supported me to be able to do that. But I knew I had to stay in school, so I lived by myself. I worked 4 nights a week in Texas home base, all day Saturday and Sunday, and I finished my high school education. And then I had the support of teachers who funneled me into textiles and said, "You do this. You're an artistic kid, but your artistic ability needs to have a trade behind it because you need to support yourself. You can't be a sculptor, like, you know what I mean? Because you'll starve." And so that's why I was sort of funneled into textiles. But that's it, you know, and I just took it step by step and just worked my way through. But even when I went to textile college, I couldn't afford halls of residence because it was another £20 a week. And so I had to live in a bedsit in the middle of this textile town and work on the weekends. And I just had to keep going.
So you moved to London and then to New York. How old were you when you moved to New York?
It's a good question. I just finished my MA, so maybe 24. But I had no plans on moving to New York. That was a stroke of fortune.
Because it's a huge, I was just going to ask you what precipitated that, because I was going to suggest your skills that you must have learned being so independent. But yeah, how did that come about?
So the Royal College of Art puts on a degree show when you graduate, and all the students have to show their wares like it's a market. And there was recruiters from different companies coming through and hiring kids, you know, whether it was Italy or Scotland or whatever it was. And an ambassador for Calvin Klein came through, a recruiter, and looked at everybody's work and just turned to me and said, "Would you like to work in New York?" And I had nowhere to go back to. Couldn't go back to Glasgow because where was I going to live? What was I going to do? And so if someone had said to me, you know, "Do you want to move to Norway? Do you want to move to, you know, Leighton Buzzard?" I would have said yes. And it just happened. It was someone from New York. And I said, yeah. And I borrowed a suitcase from my big sister, a wee red suitcase. And 2 months later, I was in New York and hated it at first. Hated it. I was lonely, and it's a city that doesn't care about your feelings, and it doesn't really care if you make it or not. And I was here by myself. And so it was a hard 2 years, but I finally found the groove, and it's been 20 years and I'm still here.
20 years, still there, a kind of American dream. Well, I think we've run out of time. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. We hope you'll support us by sharing news of our events and by donating what you can. It all goes towards the cost of this year's festival and the future ones. Coast is Queer couldn't happen without the support of Arts Council England, the Universities of Sussex and Brighton, BN3 Property Renovations, and Natalie Collins, whose donation to the festival is made in memory of her wife, Karen Street. Thank you, Natalie. You'll be sent a survey to tell us what you thought of the event. Please do fill it in. It helps with our funders. And if this event has whetted your appetite, in the next few minutes, our next feature will be from novelist Tori Peters, who Douglas name-checked a minute ago. She's talking about her new book, Detransition Baby, which The Guardian has just called one of the great trans-realist novels. Sorry, the first great trans-realist novel. It's an amazing achievement, and I think it might be one of the most important queer books of the year, and it is only February. So do check that out. For now, all that remains for me to do is to say thank you so much to Douglas Stuart. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.